There's a moment in every conversation, every conflict, every power exchange where you feel the pull. Someone questions your decision. They challenge your authority. They demand to know why. And in that split second, every fiber of your being wants to explain yourself, to justify, to make them understand, to prove you're not what they're implying. But Sun Tzu, the ancient Chinese military strategist who never lost a battle, would tell you this is the exact moment you surrender your power. Because the warrior who explains his strategy has already lost the war. The general who justifies his decisions invites mutiny. And the person who feels compelled to make others understand has just handed over control of the battlefield. This is Sun Tzu's brutal truth that cuts through 25 centuries of human psychology. When you explain yourself, you're not clarifying, you're submitting. You're accepting that someone else has the authority to demand answers from you. You're playing a game where they set the rules, hold the cards, and control the frame. And in that game, even if your explanation is perfect, logical and true, you've already lost because you've acknowledged they have power over you. Antes de continuar, se você está percebendo que essas estratégias fazem sentido, que você já viu isso acontecer na sua vida, ou conhece alguém que domina esse jogo de poder, deixa o like neste vídeo. Se inscreve no canal porque vou te mostrar muito mais sobre como o poder realmente funciona. E comenta aqui embaixo. Isso acontece com você? Você conhece alguém que age assim? Quero saber sua experiência. Agora vamos mais fundo. Sun Tzu wrote The Art of War, not as a guide to violence, but as a manual for gaining advantage without fighting. His core principle was this: the supreme art of war is to subdue the enemy without battle. And nowhere is this more applicable than in the daily wars of perception, status, and psychological dominance. When someone demands an explanation from you, they're launching an attack. Not with weapons, but with the expectation that you owe them something. And the moment you give it, you've been defeated without them lifting a finger. Think about the most powerful people you've encountered in your life. Not the loudest, not the ones constantly justifying themselves, but those who carried an aura of unquestionable authority. When they made a decision, it stood. When they spoke, it was final. When questioned, they didn't scramble to explain. They might acknowledge, redirect, or simply move forward, but they never engaged in the desperate dance of justification. Why? Because they understood what Sun Tzu knew. He who knows when to fight and when not to fight will be victorious. And explaining yourself is a fight you can never win because the terms of victory aren't defined by truth, they're defined by perception. Let's break down the psychology. When you explain yourself, several things happen simultaneously, all of them devastating to your position. First, you validate the questioner's authority. By providing an explanation, you're essentially saying, you have the right to question me, and I accept the burden of proof. Second, you shift from a position of certainty to one of defense. The explainer is never seen as confident. They're seen as someone who needs approval. Third, you give your opponent ammunition. Every word you use to explain can be twisted, reinterpreted, or used against you later. Sun Tzu said it perfectly. If you know the enemy and know yourself, you need not fear the result of 100 battles. But when you explain, you're revealing yourself while learning nothing about your opponent. Here's the mechanism most people miss. Explanation creates a power vacuum, and whoever asks the question rushes in to fill it. They become the judge. You become the defendant. They asked, so they must have authority. You answered, so you must be accountable. This dynamic happens in microseconds, beneath conscious awareness, but everyone in the room feels it. The energy shifts. The questioner gains status, you lose it, regardless of how good your explanation is. Because status in human interactions isn't about logic, it's about frame control. And the person asking the questions controls the frame. Sun Tzu would tell you this: in war, let your plans be dark and impenetrable as night, and when you move, fall like a thunderbolt. Your decisions, your motivations, your strategies should be mysterious, not transparent. Mystery creates respect. Clarity creates contempt. When people can't fully understand your reasoning, they assume depth. When you explain everything, they assume weakness. This isn't about being secretive for its own sake. It's about understanding that human psychology respects what it cannot fully grasp and dismisses what it thinks it understands completely. Let me give you a concrete scenario. You're in a meeting. You make a decision. Someone says, "I'm not sure I understand your reasoning on this. Can you walk us through your thinking?" The average person hears this as a genuine request for information and launches into explanation. But Sun Tzu, trained general, would hear the real message. "I'm testing whether you're certain of your position, and I'm creating an opportunity for you to undermine yourself. The strategic response isn't explanation, it's deflection or closure. The decision stands, we'll see the results, or I've considered the factors, let's move forward. Short, final, non-defensive. What happens next is crucial. The questioner has 3 options. They can accept your authority and move on, in which case you've won. They can push harder, in which case they start to look unreasonable while you remain calm and you've still won. Or they can try to undermine you to others later, but now they're doing it without having extracted any information from you, which means they're working with less ammunition. In every scenario, your refusal to explain leaves you stronger than you started. Here's where it gets deeper. Sun Tzu's strategy of never explaining isn't about being closed off or uncommunicative. It's about choosing when and how you reveal information based on strategic advantage, not emotional pressure. Sun Tzu said all warfare is based on deception. Hence, when we are able to attack, we must seem unable. When using our forces, we must appear inactive. When we are near, we must make the enemy believe we are far away. When far away, we must make him believe we are near. Applied to daily interactions, this means when you're confident, you don't need to appear confident through explanation. When you're right, you don't need to prove rightness through justification. Your certainty should be evident in your stillness, not your words. The corporate world is filled with people who explain themselves into irrelevance. They send long emails justifying decisions. They schedule meetings to walk everyone through their thought process. They create presentations defending their choices. And with each explanation, they dilute their authority because they're training others to question them. They're establishing a pattern. If you push, I will justify. If you doubt, I will prove. If you challenge, I will explain. This pattern is poison to leadership because leadership requires the ability to make decisions that others follow without requiring constant validation. Contrast this with the Sun Tzu approach. The decision is communicated clearly and simply. Questions are met with confidence, not elaborate justification. If someone needs clarity on implementation, that's different from demanding you justify your reasoning. One is about execution, the other is about authority. Sun Tzu's general gives clear orders for execution, but never debates the wisdom of the strategy with subordinates. Why? Because debate implies equality of position, and in matters of decisive action, equality of position creates paralysis. Now let's talk about personal relationships, because this is where people get confused. They think never explaining yourself means being cold, distant, or uncommunicative. That's not it at all. Intimacy requires vulnerability and sharing. But there's a massive difference between sharing and explaining yourself defensively. When your partner says, "Why did you do that?" your response depends on the energy behind the question. If it's genuine curiosity from a place of connection, sharing your thought process can deepen intimacy. But if it's an accusation, a challenge, a test of your judgment, then explanation is surrender. Sun Tzu teaches us to recognize the nature of the battle before engaging. Is this person seeking understanding or seeking dominance? Are they curious or challenging? The energy tells you everything. When someone comes at you with accusation energy, "Where did you go? Why didn't you tell me? How could you think that was okay?" They're not looking for information. They're looking for you to submit to their frame of reality, to accept that you were wrong, that you owe them justification. The strategic move is not explanation but frame control. I made the choice I thought was right, or we see this differently, or I'm not going to defend my judgment to you. Here's the thing that makes this so powerful. When you don't explain yourself, one of 2 things happens. Either the person respects your boundary and backs off, in which case the relationship improves because you've established healthy authority, or they escalate, becoming more aggressive and demanding, in which case they reveal themselves as someone who fundamentally doesn't respect your autonomy, and you've just learned something crucial about them. Either way, you win by gaining clarity and maintaining your position. Sun Tzu said, "The wise warrior avoids the battle." Explaining yourself is a battle that never ends because there's no victory condition. You can explain perfectly and they can still say, "I don't buy it," or "That doesn't make sense to me," or "I need more." It's an infinite loop where you expend energy and gain nothing. The wise warrior recognizes this trap and simply doesn't enter it. Not with hostility, not with arrogance, just with calm certainty that their decisions don't require external validation. Let's get tactical. Here are Sun Tzu's battle-tested methods for maintaining control without explanation. First, the strategic silence. When questioned in a way that feels like a challenge, pause. Let silence sit for 2 or 3 seconds. This does multiple things. It shows you're not rattled. It makes the questioner uncomfortable. It signals that you're choosing whether to respond, not compelled to respond. Then, if you speak, it's brief and final. The decision is made, or I'm comfortable with my choice, or let's see how it plays out. No elaboration, no justification, just statement of fact. Second, the redirect. Sun Tzu teaches that the clever combatant imposes his will on the enemy, but does not allow the enemy's will to be imposed on him. When someone tries to put you on the defensive with why questions, redirect to outcome or forward motion. Instead of explaining why you made the choice, focus on what happens next. Here's what we're doing now, or the next step is this, or let's focus on execution. You've just moved the conversation from judgment of your reasoning to practical implementation. You've seized control of the frame without fighting. Third, the mirror technique. Sun Tzu valued knowing your enemy. When someone demands explanation, sometimes the most powerful move is to mirror the question back. What would you have done? Or what's your concern specifically? Or what's driving this question? Suddenly they're explaining themselves. They're revealing their motives, their fears, their challenges, and you're gathering intelligence while they're expending energy. This is pure Sun Tzu. In the midst of chaos, there is also opportunity. Their attack becomes your reconnaissance mission. Fourth, the acknowledgement without agreement. Sun Tzu knew that sometimes you must give ground to gain advantage elsewhere. You can acknowledge someone's perspective without validating their right to interrogate you. I hear that you see it differently, or I understand your concern, followed immediately by, and I'm moving forward with this approach. You haven't explained. You haven't justified. You've simply acknowledged their position exists while maintaining yours. This is sophisticated because it's hard to attack. You weren't dismissive, but you also didn't submit. Fifth, the outcome appeal. Sun Tzu said, in war, the victorious strategist only seeks battle after the victory has been secured. Apply this to explanation by pointing to results rather than reasoning. Let's evaluate this based on outcomes, or time will tell if this was right, or results will speak for themselves. You've just moved from the subjective realm of justifying your thought process to the objective realm of measurable results. And here's the key. Results are future, so you've closed the current conversation while maintaining your position. The digital arena requires special attention because the dynamics are amplified. Someone challenges you online, questions your post, demands you explain yourself. The temptation to write a long defensive response is enormous because the audience is watching. But Sun Tzu would tell you this is exactly when explanation is most dangerous, because you're not just submitting to one person, you're demonstrating to hundreds or thousands that you can be put on the defensive. The strategic move is radical brevity or total silence. If you respond at all, it's a single line that closes the door. Noted or think what you like or we disagree. Then silence. No follow-up, no clarification, no engagement with their response. What this does psychologically is fascinating. The person who challenged you expected engagement. They threw out bait, anticipating you'd bite. When you don't, they're left holding their own challenge, and it starts to feel weak. They might post again, try to bait you harder, but now they look increasingly desperate while you look increasingly unbothered. The audience isn't watching your explanation because there isn't one. They're watching the dynamic, and the dynamic shows one person calm and unmoved, another person trying harder and harder to get a reaction. Status flows to the unmoved. Sun Tzu's ultimate teaching on this is about energy conservation. He said, the good fighters of old first put themselves beyond the possibility of defeat, and then waited for an opportunity of defeating the enemy. When you explain yourself constantly, you're in a state of perpetual defense, constantly expending energy to maintain your position. It's exhausting and unsustainable. But when you refuse to explain, you're conserved. You're fortress. Attacks come, but don't penetrate because there's nothing to penetrate. You're not engaged in the battle, so you can't lose it. Here's the transformation this creates over time. People stop questioning you as much. Not because you've become hostile or unapproachable, but because they've learned that questioning you doesn't yield the emotional payoff of watching you scramble to explain. You've trained your environment. Sun Tzu called this shaping the enemy. You shape how people interact with you by consistently refusing to play certain games. Eventually, they stop trying to start those games because there's no reward in it. This doesn't mean you never share your reasoning. Strategic communication is different from defensive explanation. When you choose proactively to walk someone through your thinking because it serves a purpose, maybe it helps them execute better, maybe it develops them, maybe it builds strategic alliance. That's not explanation, that's communication. The difference is in who controls the frame. Are you sharing because you want to, or because you feel compelled to defend yourself? The first is power, the second is weakness. Sun Tzu teaches that perception is reality in combat. How you're perceived determines how you're treated, which determines your options, which determines outcomes. When you explain yourself constantly, you're perceived as uncertain, defensive, someone whose authority can be questioned. When you don't explain, when you move with quiet certainty, you're perceived as someone who knows something others don't, someone operating from a position of strength, someone who doesn't need approval, and this perception becomes self-fulfilling. People treat you with more respect, which gives you more room to maneuver, which leads to better outcomes, which reinforces the perception. The final level of this strategy is what Sun Tzu called winning without fighting. When you've established a pattern of never explaining yourself defensively, people stop attacking because they know it won't work. They've learned that questioning you doesn't make you scramble, challenging you doesn't make you weak, demanding justification doesn't yield results. So they stop, not because they fear you in an aggressive sense, but because they respect the boundary you've established. You've won the war by making battle unnecessary. This is the ultimate expression of strategic superiority, changing the environment so that challenges to your authority don't even arise. Think about the difference this makes across months and years. The person who explains themselves constantly is forever defending, forever justifying, forever in reactive mode. Their energy is drained by constant emotional labor. Their authority erodes with each explanation. Their decisions are second-guessed because they've established that second-guessing yields engagement. Now look at the person who follows Sun Tzu's teaching. They make decisions clearly. They communicate what needs to be communicated, but they don't defend, don't justify, don't explain themselves to those who challenge their authority. Over time, they're questioned less, respected more, given more autonomy, treated as someone whose judgment is sound, not because they're perfect, but because they've controlled the frame. Sun Tzu's teaching here connects to his larger philosophy of warfare. He didn't see battle as the goal, he saw victory as the goal, and often the best path to victory was making battle unnecessary. Applied to never explaining yourself, the goal isn't to be stubborn or closed off. It's to maintain your authority and autonomy, and often the best path to that is simply refusing to engage in defensive justification. You're not being difficult, you're being strategic. You're not being cold, you're being powerful. You're not being dismissive, you're being certain. The moment you stop explaining yourself defensively is the moment you reclaim your power. The moment you realize that you don't owe everyone access to your reasoning is the moment you become dangerous in the best way possible. Dangerous meaning people can't manipulate you with questions. They can't destabilize you with challenges. They can't make you doubt yourself by demanding justification. You become like Sun Tzu's ideal general. Mysterious in strategy, decisive in action, unmovable in position, victorious without unnecessary battle. This is how you gain control instantly, not by dominating others, but by refusing to surrender yourself.